very much for having me and for organizing this summer school. I think it's really nice that you can do something on campus, so that's great. I'll be talking with you about institutional coherence in the digital economy. I'll explain it a bit more into detail later, but I will focus on the institutional framework and the question who should do what in public enforcement. So firstly, I will briefly focus on digital markets. Then I'll go into the issue of blurring boundaries between legal branches in EU economic law. And I'll try to illustrate my argument by explaining the Facebook case. As already mentioned by several of you, we see various digital platforms occurring in this digital economy. Most of you will know what those platforms are, so I won't go much into detail. I'll only explain my focus today. As already explained in the first presentation, those digital platforms are causing a lot of trouble and at the same time a lot of opportunities. So there's some kind of tension there. I'm mainly focusing on the problems today, and in particular the problems for the functioning of the market. So my presentation will, to a very large extent, be market-based, and I will look at the functioning of those digital markets and market failures on those digital markets, as well as potential regulatory responses to solve these market failures. So that's the bottom line of my presentation. So before we can go into the legal framework, it's very important to understand what digital markets are. Digital markets are a particular kind of market. Unfortunately, it's not possible to distinguish those digital markets from traditional or brick and mortar markets by one single characteristic. However, there are several features which we will briefly discuss now that are very peculiar for those digital markets and distinct them in a certain way from the more traditional markets. First of all, we have the omnipresence of platforms. So on those digital platforms, on those digital markets, we find loads of very large platforms. And those are, or I define them as, digital infrastructures that match buyers and sellers. So we have this intermediary function. And as also explained in the first presentation, there's a lot of interesting economic theory on this point. Some economists argue that there's no economic problem per se with those intermediaries, but in my presentation today, I will be focusing on the technological giants. So there we see at least a certain degree of market failure because they have a very concentrated and strong position and because there's not too much competition left on those markets. You can think of the usual suspects, so Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc. Then a second feature for those digital markets, which very closely aligns with the previous point, is the existence of very strong network effects. A network effect is the convenience of using a technology that is depending on the use by others. So, in other words, the utility of a certain service may increase because others adopt the same technology of service. We have direct networks, which you can find at one side of the platform. The most classical example of a direct network effect is mobile telephone. It makes no use to buy a telephone if no one else has it, because then you can't call anyone. The same thing happens on those digital communication networks. WhatsApp, for example, very easy to use because everyone's using it. But Ping, the original communication service of BlackBerry, is not very useful anymore because no one else is using it. Indirect network effects follow the same logic but expose themselves at different sides of the platform. It's most easy to explain this by example. So if we have eBay, for example, we see buyers and sellers. The platform becomes more attractive for the buyers if there are more sellers, because then there's more choice. And vice versa, the platform becomes more interesting for retailers if they have more customers, because then there's more demand. The third feature that's important for today is that a lot of platforms are free of charge. On this slide, you can see the terms of services of Facebook, and there you see that we don't charge a monetary fee to use Facebook. This does by no means entail that Facebook is a philanthropic organization without a profit aim. No, they just have another revenue model than most undertakings on normal markets. They sell advertisement space on the basis of a particular profile. So what Facebook is doing, they're collecting your data, and on the basis of this data, they have a very good idea of who you are and what you want. Then they sell this profile to undertakings that are interested in targeted advertisement. So if you're a restaurant in Utrecht, this is an example of an advertisement that was targeted at me. You can say, I'm very interested in younger people living in Utrecht that like food, essentially. So it can be very detailed. And undertakings are willing to pay a lot of money for this, and that's the revenue model of Facebook. Then, finally, and this also interlinks with the previous point, a lot of transactions are data driven. Because of course, in order to create this profile, data is needed. So a lot of personal data is exchanged on those digital markets. So this was some background in order to describe the most important features of those digital markets. With those features, certain market failures may occur. We've already seen that markets can become very concentrated. On a lot of those digital or personal data markets, we have very few undertakings holding a very large and strong position. This can partially be explained by the network effects. Because if for a service you're dependent on other users, it becomes very difficult to switch. If you, for example, don't like WhatsApp anymore because they merged with Facebook, you can hardly switch to another services because all your friends are still on WhatsApp. That also may facilitate a certain winner-takes-it-all dynamic. And this essentially means that in the beginning or after innovation, there's a certain degree of competition on a market, but at a certain point, one undertaking wins the competition because they make the most efficient use of data and get to exploit the network effect. At that point, the market tips and we end up in this very concentrated market. So here you can see that there's a huge risk on market failures on these digital markets. And as is also mentioned in one of the previous presentations, here in the Western world, we really like to rely on the market. So a free market based on the idea of an invisible hand is presumed to result in the most efficient outcome. This is different if there are market failures, because those market failures prevent the market from facilitating this efficient outcome. And in that case, regulatory action is needed. So in other words, the government should intervene to solve the market problems. Then the next question is, from which field of public policy should be intervened? We have various fields of laws that may be relevant here. First of all, we have competition law, because competition law aims to safeguard competition by solving the market failure of concentration. So that's definitely a relevant field here. However, at the same time, data protection may be very relevant because, as we have seen in the characteristics, a lot of those transactions involve personal data. Then thirdly, we also have consumer protection law because online consumers are, just as any consumer, protected by these consumer laws. So we see an overlap with blurring boundaries. All those three legal fields are applicable and they do to an increasing extent overlap. In order to show how this overlap reveals itself in practice, I would like to discuss the Facebook case with you. You're probably familiar with Facebook, a very large social network platform that also owns other social network services like Instagram and WhatsApp. In order to use Facebook, you have to agree with the user's agreement to Facebook terms of services. And as we have seen previously, Facebook is making its money by selling targeted advertisement space. So it's collecting your data, and the more Facebook knows of you, the better their targeted advertisement is, so the more money they can make. And in order to create this profile, Facebook is of course harvesting your data because they need this information to create the profile. They're doing so on the network, but also beyond the network. And that's where all those cases that I will be discussing are focusing on. So Facebook is making use of certain plugins and buttons on third-party websites. So you can see here a Dutch newspaper, for example, where you can directly share a newspaper article by pressing on the Facebook button. And that's an example of such a plugin. Very ironically, the title of this newspaper article is it wise to log in by using Facebook? That's a funny thing, but this is the practice of Facebook that became subject to criticism. And a lot of authorities, different authorities, took action in this regard. And as we will see, the action was taken by different enforcers enforcing all those three fields of law. In Germany, the competition authority took action on the basis of both competition and data protection law, and in Italy, the consumer authority took action on the basis of consumer law. So, the German case. The German Bundeskartellamt, the competition law authority, was taking action on the basis of Article 102. So they said, Facebook, you are dominant, and by harvesting this data on third-party websites, you're abusing your dominant position. We won't go into the market definition dominance part, but we're focusing on the abuse here. Because very interestingly, what the Bundeskartellamt was saying, to put it a bit more simplistic, Facebook, because you're violating data protection rules, you're abusing your position. So they make a very clear link between data protection and competition law, because the line of reasoning is that if you, as a dominant undertaking, violate data protection law, you're also abusing your dominant position, and therefore also fines can be imposed under competition law. So here we see the first blurring line, namely between data protection and competition law. I see some of you looking very critically already, and indeed the judgment received a lot of criticism, both from a substantive and an institutional perspective. From the substantive perspective, it was asked whether in a competition law assessment you may even impose those data protection considerations. And then from the institutional perspective, people were very critically and stated that the competition authority was acting within the realm of the data protection authorities. The decision was set aside by the Düsseldorf Higher Regional Court, but then there was an appeal, and in the appeal, preliminary questions were asked. So there's no end of the story yet, and now the European Court of Justice has the opportunity to decide on the matter and to clarify this relationship between competition and data protection law. This case is still pending, so we don't have the definitive answer yet, and it's all going very slow. So that's a bit problematic for the people who suffered or who found that their data is violating, or the competitors of Facebook, of course, who feel that they suffered damage from those practices. So this was the first part of the story, and here we just have to wait and see. We don't know the outcome yet. However, it's not the end of the story, because there's also a consumer protection perspective that is relevant for this case. Because in Italy, the authority responsible for both competition and consumer law also imposed a fine. However, they based themselves on the Italian consumer code and not on competition law, because what they said was Facebook is misleading its consumers and is using aggressive practices here. So they violated consumer law. So we see here that all three fields of law are imposed to one similar conduct. And that's very interesting because it makes it very unclear who should do what, essentially. And that results in questions on institutional coherence, because if we have all those different authorities imposing those different fields of law, it becomes very unclear how they relate to each other and who should do what. And that leads to questions in terms of streamlining mechanisms, because if it's unclear who should do what, it's, for example, uncertain whether the German privacy authority can still act here if the competition law authority was already imposing those data protection considerations. And we do have some mechanisms to streamline overlapping competences between different authorities, but those mechanisms to a very large extent are limited to cooperation within one legal branch. The mechanism to facilitate cooperation between the different national competition law authorities and the European Commission is, for example, very elaborate. And also in data protection law, we have mechanisms that may solve potential conflicts between the different national enforcers. There's one initiative that aims to facilitate discussion between the different enforcers of competition, data protection and consumer law, and that's the Digital Clearinghouse. However, this is still a very informal initiative and no real steps are taken there at this point. So this is really a discussion forum and it's not really an exchange of cases, for example. And it's very difficult to solve this problem because, of course, we're also dealing with different legal bases. So it's not clear from the perspective of independence whether it's even desirable to facilitate or streamline these interactions. So we have a lot of open questions here, and I found these questions really interesting, and I hope to answer at least some of them in my PhD project. I hope this gave you a small grasp of what my research is about, and if you have any further questions, feel free to ask them, or you can also engage with me by email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belle. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have two questions, in fact. Thanks and congratulations for both presentations, which have been great. So my first question is about the ABBA image, this idea of the winner take it all, because I think that from the outside, we as citizens and also legal scholars, we are afraid about this possibility, about the possibility of having these digital hegemons achieving this winner takes it all position and having big competition issues afterwards. But economic theory, as I try to explain, even though in a very, very quick manner, they consistently says that's not the case. And all the literature and not only economists, but also legal scholars that rely on economists and all the competition agencies, they tend to adhere with this idea. And it's a continuum. For instance, I don't know, the last issue of the Yale Journal, Heaven Overcraft said, has published an article about antitrust and competition and digital platforms. And this idea, and it's from last week, is always there. That's the main idea. But the interesting thing is that they say that, but we, as normal citizens, we do not see this reality, because what we see is Google, who is bigger and bigger and bigger each day, each year. We see Amazon, that after some years of even losing money, now it has a profit, and each year and each semester increases its profit. We see a trend of concentration in digital agents that doesn't correspond with this theory. But the problem is that all agencies are relying on this theory. So my first question would be, do you consider this theory holds and we have to stick to this theory, or we have to try to counterbalance, or we have to do legal scholarship from a different perspective? And if so, how we can build that? Because on the one hand, we have Google and Amazon, etc. But on the other hand, the economists say, wow, 20 years is not enough. Or maybe it's because Google and Amazon are the most efficient for the moment, but the day another company more efficient and who gives more profit to consumers than this. And they always say, well, you have Instagram, which is Facebook too, but or TikTok, or the Chinese company that also sells goods. So they say the possibility is there, and the consumer switch. That would be my first question. And well, but if you want,
should I answer this one first? Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and also a very complicated one, because what we see is that those digital platforms or networks are really challenging the entire framework. If we're focusing on competition law now, for example, we had these theories of harm that indeed very much focused on price, whereas here, as I explained, a lot of services are free, at least for one side of the platform. So what should they be doing then? And also, which role is there to play for data? Can a price, for example, be excessive just because there's too much data being harvested? And I also think that's something that the authorities are struggling with in practice, and they now try to find their way, and I think they're successfully doing so at the moment, because, for example, the European Commission imposed those huge fines on Google. And I definitely agree with you that there's still a mismatch between economics and the reality we're facing today, and I think that's also something the authorities are struggling with now. I find it difficult to formulate a definitive answer here, also because I'm not an economist myself, but I really think that we're facing some kind of paradigm shift, and that a lot of developments are to be expected here, because all the authorities are now trying to reformulate their theories of harm. The self-preferencing behavior by Google was, for example, by the European Commission brought under this Article 102 TFEU, so they seem to find it problematic, and in their line of reasoning they also explicitly mention that the services are free of charge and that there are these large network effects. So I think what is happening at the moment is that we're faced with this very rapid and sometimes disruptive innovation, right? And I think everyone is struggling still because it's going so fast. But I think in line with all the developments we're seeing now, both at the European and the national levels, that the different enforcers are finding their way. So I think in a few years' time, there will probably be more clarity in this regard. And also, yeah, for me, it's of course impossible to predict the future, but I find your question very interesting. Are those technological giants still there in 20 years' time, or will the market solve this concentration issue? But in the same time, I think there's another more normative question, because would it be in time if the market solved this in 20 questions, or are we facing problems today, and should those problems be solved today?
Yes, I completely agree with you. That's the typical John Maynard Keynes answer to that kind of problems. Well, in the middle term, we are all dead. So maybe 20 years. That will be solved by the market. because of its self-regulation, but in 20 years maybe the problems that we have faced before the market settles the issue are so big and so problematic. So I would tend to agree with you, but my second question is related to that. And my second question is related to the fact that maybe if we agree on this perspective, the perspective that the traditional theories of harm, the more economic approach, they tend not to be able to answer these questions because from those perspectives, there's no problem at all. But we see a problem. And as a citizens, as a societies, we see a problem. And we see the problem that maybe if we don't fix it right now, we will face bigger problems in the future. But our competition authorities, as you said, they are struggling, trying to change their methodological tools, etc. So my second question would be if this process is quick enough or not, because the feeling I have, and your exposition has consolidated it, is that they are still using traditional tools, and they struggle to try to fit these theories and tools from the past to new realities which are not suited for that. For instance, they are obsessed, and the Facebook case with the German authorities is clear, with the abuse of dominant position. And they try to discover abuses, and they use data protection. They use this in order to say, no, but we can see an abuse. And maybe the problem is not the abuse. The problem is the dominant position itself in those markets. And they cannot change the mindset because the problem is not whether they are able or not to analyze data protection regulations. I'm quite sure and quite confident they can. The problem is that they are saying there's a problem with data protection when the data protection authorities is saying there are not. And that's the problem. The problem is not using data protection breaches of law to say there's an abuse. The problem is that they are saying there's a breach when data protection authorities say everything's okay. So maybe the problem is that we are distorting the idea of data protection and the idea of abuse of dominant position, because those are the only tools we have, that maybe we need a different tool, not only to use abuse of dominant position and data protection, because it seems that everything comes down to data protection. And data protection is wonderful, it's very necessary, but I think it's not the only tool and the only solution that we have.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that new solutions are needed. First, on your data protection point, I think what is also argued in literature and by the policymakers as well, that the data protection authorities are just not up to the task, because those are all national authorities with very limited resources. They've quite recently been established, and they're fighting these huge multinational undertakings, right? So that's a thing or an argument that is used by competition scholars to justify the fact that they also impose data protection considerations. Then towards your main point, I definitely agree with you that something should be done, because imposing competition laws sometimes really feels like putting a round peg in a square hole, you know, because we have those tools and mechanisms, but only the delineation of the relevant market, for example, is so complex on those digital markets that it takes years, because Google is not only active on this market for general search, which is super complex in itself, because it has two sides as it is, because it's free for one side. It's also linking it to those other services as the shopping comparison, the Google Health, etc. So I really think that this is an example where we can see that competition law is just too slow to really do something. And in that light, I think that the DMA proposal is really desirable, because that's really an instrument that aims to target the weaknesses of competition law. It's also said in the preamble that competition law is indeed very much focusing on this abuse, whereas in these gatekeeper markets, we sometimes really see that not the abuse in itself, but the structure in the market is problematic. And in this light, I really think that this ex ante tool can, yeah, you referred to it as well. And that's a point where I definitely agree with you that an ex ante tool can do more, because then you have this very clear set of obligations and prohibitions, and it just becomes easier to tweak the behavior of those technological undertakings. I think at the same time, what is key for the success of the DMA is the way in which it can be adjusted, because we have this list now and there certain behavior is listed. For example, this self-preferencing behavior or mixing data sets, etc. And this list, to a very large extent, just mirrors ongoing antitrust cases or investigations, because we see the Google case in there, we see the recent investigations into Amazon, etc. So that's all very desirable from the point where we're standing now. But what we also see is that those markets are changing so quickly and that they're so innovative that today's list may be useless for tomorrow's practices. So the Commission has the ability to change the list, and I really hope that that's something that will stay in the proposal, because of course there are very strong lobby actions going on now, and it's not yet certain whether the proposal will make it in the end. So I think that's the downside of having this very clear set of rules, that you can't predict the future, so you need some flexibility there. But I definitely agree with you that competition law alone is not enough at this point and that we need something extra. And I think the DMA can be, with this ex ante approach, be a very good step in the right direction.
Thank you. I think, Sebastian, you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks a lot for both of you for these great presentations. I had a question regarding institutional coherence in the framework of the GDPR. I don't know if you've probably seen the ECJ case of Facebook against the Belgian DPA. I think it was last month, and maybe that's and I didn't fully read the case, but I think this is going in the right direction, no, of institutional coherence between avoiding like the one-stop shop where companies would benefit from a lax enforcement from the Irish Data Protection Agency authority. I don't know what you think about that, and if you've had the chance to look at the case more in depth.
Yeah, I briefly saw the case. I haven't read it very in depth, but I think I agree with you that it's a step in the right direction, because the risk of this one-stop shop mechanism, so for those of you less familiar with the GDPR, in the GDPR there's a mechanism that in case of cross-border processing, and it's all in Ireland. And that's of course very problematic, because the Irish authorities have by no means the capacity to deal with all those cases. And we now have a case in which the Belgian authority took action as well, and I definitely agree with you that that's a good step in the right direction. I think this will crystallize further in the future, because I think it's quite clear that the Irish authority is not up to the task. Definitely, yeah.
Thank you.